David, we're gathered here at Yale for a consultation on joy and adolescence, and you very helpfully pointed us towards the work of G. Stanley Hall, and in particularly a passage in Hall's 1906 work where he observed, adolescence is the vernal season of a human life, and he went on to opine that it's a time when the human being is uniquely open to joy and love and suffers their absence keenly. Is that 1906 observation still an apt description of the experience of adolescence today?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm going to give you a less than succinct, complex response, maybe in three parts, I'm thinking. First of all, I just want to say that I have found it helpful in more recent years to look at questions of joy, questions of delight through the lens of theological aesthetics, through the theology of folks like Hans Urs von Balthasar, Jonathan Edwards, David Bentley Hart, some of those folks who are framing the theological question in terms that at least through the 20th century, we really have not been used to thinking in those terms. We've been focused on truth and goodness. What can we reduce to propositions that people, or a logic that people can accede to, or goodness? How can we shape theology so that it produces goodness in the world for the common good? And so I have found it helpful to think in terms of beauty. And so what there is to say, there's a lot to say about beauty, and I'm just going to sort of cut to the chase here and answer the question, which is in more the terms of Thomas Aquinas, who would say that there is beauty in all things. Beauty is a predicate of all being. And so I think if we could see through the eyes of God, we would see beauty in all things. In Genesis 3, when God created all things, God declared all things good, which is the term kavod in the Hebrew, which means more literally, weighted with glory. So that's the short answer, that all things are beautiful. All things, if we could see through spiritual eyes, if we could see things as God sees them, we would see all things as beautiful, including adolescence. And so I think it's a good question whether or not Stanley Hall got it exactly right or not. I would still argue that there is a beauty to adolescence. More particularly, I would argue, as David Bentley Hart and Hans Urs von Balthasar argue, that, and this, again, they're drawing from Thomas Aquinas, that not only are things beautiful, but that all things in some way are parables of God. All things in some way are windows to the holy. And so it's, in my view, I see youth at their best when their lives haven't been distorted by systems and powers and structures. I see adolescence as absolutely a time of life that where, as I said in the paper, where merely the fact of their emergence, puberty itself, they become more conscious about the beauty of their physical bodies and the beauty of others. They become more conscious of, as they grow into the fullness of cognitive ability, they not only get a sense of, a more sophisticated sense of the world, but they get a sense of the interiority of others, which is a kind of compassion or empathy, which I absolutely would call beautiful or a source of delight. And so, but not only that, but I would argue that that looking at adolescence with that question in mind, how and whether they are a parable of God, I find helpful. I think when I see adolescents in their just the mere fact of the beauty of their bodies, their physicality, I see that as a window into God's own beauty and the beauty of all creation. That God declared good and kavod. I also see in the connection, the interiority that adolescents are developing. I see that as a parable of God's own searching for us and God's own interior life of relationality. And so I'm not going to spin out the litany of ways that I think youth are parables of God, but I do think that is an important way to think about adolescence. So the third thing I want to say, it just has to do, as I mentioned, with the distortions of adolescence. In my paper, I talk about, and others have also hit this point, emphasized this point, but we live in a world in which the adolescent body, the adolescent visage has been commodified. It's used to sell everything from soap to breakfast cereal. It's been sexualized, at an increasingly early age, and not only that, but the schooling, the process of schooling has been bureaucratized and routinized in such a way that the joy and the delight of learning is in some sense muted. Adolescence, further, in the world of industrial capitalism and now late capitalism, it's the ways in which youth have had freedom to create relationships, forge relationships, and including connection to the earth. In G. Stanley Hall's view, those capacities I think are still fundamentally alive in adolescence, but I think they've been suppressed by ideologies and worldviews that constitute a kind of iron cage of rationality, as Max Weber says. Everything has been rationalized in terms of market values and market concepts. And so the question for adolescents becomes more a question of technical rationality. What does this person mean for me? How can this person serve me in some way? How can the earth, serve me in some way, instead of the question of its intrinsic good or the intrinsic beauty of creation. So it's the distortions of youth are twofold. Youth themselves have been taught to see all things through the lens of technical rationality, but we adults also have learned to see adolescence through those lenses. And so we're not asking the same questions G. Stanley Hall was asking, which is, where do we find life and exuberance and joy? Now the questions we impose on youth are, how will you make a profit? How will you serve to stimulate the economy? And then, on a more practical level, how will you, serve me in my retirement, age as I get older? And so all of these questions have served to kind of rationalize in a very technical way the value of youth. So that's a long answer to your question. I think Stanley Hall's observations, if we have eyes to see, are still valuable. But I think we live in a world where there's so many pressures and powers and principalities that sort of impose structures onto adolescents that make it hard for us to see them through those lenses, but also hard for them to live into them in the way that they are meant to.